I'm going to tell you a story, no coding required, in case your brains are already full. So a couple of weeks ago, I heard someone say that fonts, or more accurately, the points and lines that define individual glyphs, were devoid of life. It's not that glyphs couldn't be beautiful or well-crafted or have a certain style, but it was this person's assertion that it wasn't until a font was typeset on a page that it truly came to life. I would argue that one particular category of fonts, fonts based on historic handwriting, already have life deeply embedded into their DNA. The original handwritten letters these fonts are based on carried personal messages of hope and heartbreak, declarations of love and war. They documented struggles for freedom and liberty. They announced the birth of babies. And one particular document even announced the birth of a nation. Remarkable milestones are ingrained into the curves and lines of these fonts. I'm talking about fonts such as P22 Declaration, based on the handwriting of Timothy Matlack, Houston Pen, Abigail Adams, A. Lincoln, Douglas Pen, P22 Cezanne, Albert Einstein Pro, and there are many other examples in addition to the few I've shown here. So today I want to tell you about one other font inextricably bound to history. P22 Marcel script is based on the letters written by Marcel Heuzé to his wife Renee and their 3 daughters. Marcel may not be a household name, but I'm on a mission to change that. Marcel was a Frenchman forced to work in Germany during World War II, and as such, he had an unwanted front row seat to witness history. And I would claim the emotions Marcel committed to paper, love and hope and longing, are embedded into the curves and the lines of the font that bears his name. This project started in 2002 when I found a cache of Marcel's letters at an antique store near my home in Minnesota. I had been keeping an eye out for old handwritten letters, source documents I could trace for a new font. These letters had the kind of scratchy, lyrical writing I had been looking for. The letters were inexpensive, $6.40 each, and I couldn't even read them. They'd been written in French. I don't know French, but that didn't matter. An A in French looks like an A in English. I could see the letters were from World War II, 1943, 1944 specifically, and it seemed as though they could be love letters. Things like the Hitler stamps or the fact that one letter bore a swastika weren't a consideration one way or the other. I dismissed those things as relics from the era. All I cared about was the handwriting. 20 or so letters were for sale that day in the store. I selected 5 based on which letters had the best source material for the font. One letter had a beautiful swash M. Another had a lovely J, a P, an R. One had numbers. I brought the letters home, scanned them, then put the originals away for safekeeping. I traced my favorite letters from those original handwritten letters, and eventually, over the course of years, pecking away at the project evenings and weekends as I could make time, the font slowly took shape. 6 years ago, 2011, at a point I was really frustrated with the font, I pulled Marcel's original letters out of the closet where they had been since I scanned them 9 years earlier. Since I'd been looking at the glyphs in black and white and primarily as outlines, I had forgotten how beautiful the original letters were. I had forgotten about the yellowness of the paper, the blue and brown ink, the blue and red painted stripes. I had forgotten about the tenderness that seemed so obvious in the writing. I knew Marcel's handwriting intimately, but I realized I didn't know anything about him. So I decided to have one letter translated, and it was just a curiosity more than anything. The content of the first letter, which I bought specifically for the beautiful sweeping M in Ma Chérie Petite, my little darlings, was not what I expected. I had presumed the letters had been from a man to a woman, but the translation revealed the letter had been from Marcel to his 3 young daughters, Suzanne, Denise, and Lily, who I later learned were 9, 7, and 4. The letter offered words of fatherly advice, such as, I recommend she doesn't pick the blossoms from the cherry or pear tree. She should wait until the fruit is ripe. In the meantime, you should go pick violets in the nearby woods. He inquired whether his eldest daughter fetched milk while his wife was in Paris, and whether his girls had a good time at Mardi Gras. He mentioned his clothes needed mending. He noted his comb broke and asked them to send a replacement. He also noted he was eating the last of the beans, and he asked them to send more. And finally, he signed the letter, from your papa, who sends his love from 1,300 kilometers away, from your papa who thinks about you all the time. So this photo shows Suzanne, Denise, and Lily about 1940. So I was curious to learn more. I didn't understand why he had been writing from Berlin, mailing letters to France, and why he would ask for beans and a comb. Marcel, I learned, had been sent to Germany as part of the Vichy regime's forced labor program, Surveille du Travail Obligatoire. The Germans needed able bodies to do the work left behind by German men who had been sent to the Eastern or the Western fronts to fight. More than 5 million laborers were imported from the occupied countries. In France, any man between the age of 18 and 50 and any single woman between the age of 21 and 35 could be forced to work for the Germans. Those who were selected were told to report for transit. If they didn't show up, they could be arrested, then forcibly sent. Compliance was enforced with the threat to send a family member in their place or to withhold the family's ration coupons, which would essentially condemn them to starvation. Selection did not have anything to do with religion, race, or political affiliation. Marcel was a metal worker. He possessed a skill the Germans wanted. In the end, about 650,000 French men and women were sent to Germany. Tens of thousands would never return. So in this photo, men and women were given a list of items to bring with them: a change of clothes, good work boots, an overcoat. And on trains like this, they were accompanied by armed guards to prevent escape during transit to Germany. Marcel was assigned to the Daimler-Benz factory in Marienfelde, Germany, a suburb of Berlin. The factory made Panther tanks and aircraft engines. It took a while to wrap my head around the reality of his situation. Marcel was forced to build tanks that would be used against those trying to liberate his country and his family. To make the situation worse, my husband pointed out the grim reality that a factory making tanks would be at the top of any list of targets that the US would want to bomb. I learned the labor camp where he was near the factory and was comprised of brick and stone barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by SS. Prisoners were subjected to long roll calls and beatings. Clean water was scarce. The food situation was dire. And I read an account of a Frenchman killed for stealing 2 carrots from a sheep pen. Yet, as a Frenchman, he was better off than others. Russians, for example, did not have the right to go into a bunker during an air raid. And men like Marcel had the ability to buy food on the black market. Russians and Poles did not. So this photo is just one of the many aerial bombing of the Daimler Marienfelde factory, and the black line shows the outline of the Daimler factory where Marcel worked. Over the following months, I had the 4 remaining letters translated. Those letters had been written to his wife, Renee. The letters to Renee had a decidedly more sober tone. Marcel told her about his life inside the labor camp. He wrote about boiling veal bones and constant hunger. At 6 o'clock, it's the evening meal, he wrote in one letter in which he detailed his daily work schedule, a letter I selected at the store because it included lots of numbers and I knew I needed numbers for the font. At 6:10, everything is done. We run errands in town or go back to the barracks to get letters and to make food because as soon as we leave the table, we are hungry again. I even learned that the act of mailing a letter took considerable time and energy. He had to go to a post office, buy a stamp. They had to put the stamp on the envelope to eliminate the risk that he might have written a coded message underneath the stamp. In another letter, Marcel noted he made crepes from flour and water. But after reading the translation again, I realized he described mixing uncooked flour with water. And if you think about it, that's essentially paste. He described seeking shelter in a bunker during an aerial bombing raid. The results of that raid, 80 guys burned alive because the Germans locked them in their barracks, he wrote. In another, he wrote, I have to tell you about how I got a new work suit yesterday. It was made in Poland. All the French here will be wearing the same thing, just like the Russians who got them, so now we won't be able to tell each other apart. And in a later letter, clothes were so scarce, he was wearing women's clothes. Something I found remarkable was that despite these conditions, Marcel's letters were filled with hope and optimism. With the exception of one passage, he always wrote about when he would come home, not if. I got glimpses of his sense of humor, such as when he promised to cook his wife German food once he got home. He talked about friends he made in camp, friends, a network vital to survival, I would come to learn. In one letter, he even described a moment when one of his buddies serenaded the barracks with a Maurice Chevalier song. And there was an inherent kindness in his letters, which I found remarkable. Writing from a camp, he still didn't lose his humanity. The letters Marcel wrote to his wife ended with endearments such as, your big guy who loves you with all his heart sends you his best love and kisses, or looking forward to holding you in my arms, or for you, my beloved one, I always save my most tender kisses. Sometimes it took weeks for the letters from Marcel or Renee to reach the other person. Some letters never made it. And each letter, I came to realize, was not just proof of love. Each letter was proof of life. As I received each additional letter back from the translator, I was pulled deeper and deeper into an obsessive quest to find out what happened to Marcel. I also wanted to know what happened to his wife and daughters. Their survival was not a given. And I wanted to know how his letters ended up at a store in Minnesota for $6.40. But most importantly, I wanted to know whether Marcel survived. As I searched for answers, I encountered people who wanted to know his fate almost as much as I did. And sometimes I felt like this typographic Pied Piper leading this motley group of people down an unknown path as I searched for Marcel's fate. I worked with 2 translators, one of whom lived in Paris during the occupation. She was a teenager when she watched her father arrested and taken away. He died on a cattle car on the way to Germany. But her testimony helped me understand how many Frenchmen simply disappeared and were never heard from again. I worked with an amazing genealogy researcher and chemical censoring specialists and archivists in Germany who earnestly tried to help and ultimately provided some puzzle pieces. One researcher uncovered the handwritten record of Marcel's entry into the labor camp. Another provided an ominous record showing Marcel had been transferred to Spandau prison. While I searched for answers, I stopped working on the font. I faced a dilemma. Could I finish it? Could I release it? It wasn't a legal dilemma, it was a moral dilemma. I didn't think I could release the font without knowing for certain what happened to him. Yet after nearly a year of searching, there was still no trace of him. It was as if everything but these handwritten letters had been erased from history. And after reading how deeply he loved his wife and daughters, I refused to let that happen. I refused to let him be forgotten. He deserved to be remembered. Every person deserves to be remembered. The details of the search and the complete text of all of Marcel's extraordinary letters, letters that have never before been public, can be found in the book, Marcel's Letters, A Font in the Search for One Man's Fate, which was published this summer. I invite you to read it. I invite you to get to know the man behind the font and read Testimony of Life Inside the Labor Camp. In 20 minutes, I can barely scratch the surface of this story, but the book also traces the letter's journey backward from the antique store to a very surprising location in Paris. And it reveals more about René's fight for survival in a 2-room cottage in a tiny farming village southwest of Paris. It includes the discovery of more letters and tells the story of the design of the font. And it shares the details of the most remarkable connection that came about because of this font. In 2012, I established contact with Marcel's family. I traveled to Paris to meet Denise, Marcel's middle daughter. She was 78 years old, and here she is reading her father's letters for the first time in 69 years. She had no recollection of ever reading or seeing his letters before, though it's possible, if not likely, she read them or had them read to her when she was 7 or 8. Some of Marcel's grandchildren, who are now in their 50s, knew he had been in Germany, but they didn't know where he worked. They didn't know anything about his time in the labor camp. They had barely heard of French forced labor. And it was only through these letters and because of the font they learned their own family history. When I was in Paris, I showed Denise and other family members the font, which at that time was still in progress. I wanted them to see this thoroughly modern incarnation of Marcel's words of love. I asked their blessing to name the font after him. They were happy to know he could live on in this way. And in fact, they told me it was as if I had brought Marcel back to life. The font was released in 2014 and is distributed by the P22 Type Foundry. The Pro version has more than 1,300 glyphs with lush ornaments, stylistic sets, and open type coding. I've seen the font used in and on books, in ads and magazines. I've also seen quite a few really beautiful custom wedding invitations, which always makes my heart soar. I have to believe the love and life embedded into the font's DNA provides a blessing from Marcel. Thank you.